Hi, and welcome to this AQA A-Level Business revision video focusing on 3.3.2, Understanding Markets and Customers. In today's video, we're going to be looking at market research, sampling, and how to interpret data. A quick reminder that my teaching here is separate from my teaching and consultancy roles at any academies or schools around the country. My name is Mr. Giles. Let's get down to business. In order to understand our customers and understand our markets, we have to undertake market research. Now, if you've never done GCSE business, some of this might be new to you. If you're in year 12 and you're just kind of coming for a revision, good for you, first of all. We're going to spin through this now. If you're in year 13, you've probably heard this a few times now, but just persevere. So there's different types of market research we can conduct. We have primary research and secondary research. Now, before you get too ahead of yourselves, please do not assign a value to either of these types of research. They are very useful in certain situations. And this is the kind of Mr. Giles' secret sauce early in this video. What we have to decide is what is the appropriate research for the business that we are dealing with. So we think about paper 2 and paper 3, we get our lovely case studies, and they're usually medium to large businesses. However, we have had in the past in paper 3, a small business been chucked in the mix. If you're in a medium to large business, then it probably is appropriate to do primary research. Because as you can imagine, conducting things like focus groups and questionnaires, they are expensive, they are time consuming, they require a team of people. Large and medium businesses have the resources to do this. A small sole trader or partnership probably doesn't have the resources, or more specifically, the market size to do this. Your local sweet shop probably doesn't need to do a questionnaire because they probably don't have much of a footfall beyond maybe 1,000 people. So really, even if they did conduct market research, out of those 1,000 people, who's really going to do the questionnaire? And then what trends can they actually ascertain? That's the kind of concept we're looking at here. However, if Tesco does market research, they have millions of customers to pick from and will be able to identify trends very easily. So primary research, as I've put on the board here, is new data. So it's when we conduct things like questionnaires, focus groups, surveys, any way, observations is one of my favorite ones, any way of collecting new data. Okay, now this is linked quite strategically with a concept called big data, which is in year 13. Secondary research is any old data that we would use to ascertain trends and ideas. Now, this could be something as simple as previous sales data. So if you've got, again, a large business that's been going for a while that can identify trends, say maybe seasonally over long periods of time, then that's good data to use. If you're just starting a business, if you're a startup, then sales data you don't have. So you can't do that. We've got things like census data from the government, but the big criticism of that is it's 10 years out of date most years. So the last census we did was 2021. So it's out of date now by nearly 6 years if you're watching this in 2025. And we also have things like competitor data as well. Okay. Now, it could be as simple as going to the competitor's website and seeing what they're doing, visiting competitors' shops, or if they're an LTD or a PLC, as you will know from my ownership videos linked below, that they have to publish their accounts and their end of year reports for everybody to see. So we would be diving into that and giving it a good old gander so we know exactly what's going on. So primary data is new data, secondary data is old data. Now, when we conduct our research, there's two different types of data we can collect. There is quantitative data, quant as in quantity, which is mostly numbers, okay? And that's very good for what we call extrapolation and identifying trends. Extrapolation is when you have a series of data that you put together that identifies what might happen in the future, and then you extrapolate that out over a longer period of time. So if you've identified for the last 2 summers that you sell more ice creams, you could extrapolate that next summer you will sell more ice creams. And then we have qualitative data, which is more opinions/feedback. And again, there is a time and a place for both of these. So you might have been asked in the past by previous businesses to fill out things like a Trustpilot review. That is qualitative data. Now, there is a star rating there, isn't there? You know, how many stars you're going to give it. That's the quantitative feedback, which is the bit that most people look at, if we're honest. But what the actual comments you write, which hopefully they respond to, is the qualitative information, and it's that quality feedback that they can act on to try and improve. Now, here's the thing: quantitative data, you need a significant amount of data, which is where questionnaires and surveys come in, to be able to identify common trends. Qualitative data, you need people who are willing to give up their time to give you honest feedback. And the big drawback of any sort of qualitative data is how much of that is people pleasing and how much of that is revenging on the business. So if you had a bad experience and you go and leave a bad review, then that might help you if you agree with the feedback, if you actually give a bad experience. But what about if, some Karen turns up and doesn't like that you're not serving insert item here, and they just want to leave you a bad review? And we see that all the time. So we have to be careful with what we're getting feedback on and from. Let's have a look now at sampling. So how we choose the people that we do our market research with. So when we're conducting market research, we're going to inevitably do some primary research, whether that be quantitative or qualitative. Maybe it's a questionnaire, focus group, observation, whatever. So we have to decide who we're going to ask or conduct our market research on. And the situation here is to do with bias. Now, if we look at where we're going to be examined on this, in year 12, this will probably be a written answer. You'll expect to be writing an answer. In year 13, it's more likely that this will be a short answer question in paper 1 or a multiple choice question. So that's kind of where we're at with this. There's 3 ways of sampling, folks. There is random, stratified, and quota. Random sampling is when you're conducting market research, anybody has a fair chance, or everybody, I should say, sorry, has a fair chance of being selected to do the market research. So you stand in the middle of your local shopping centre with a clipboard and ask everybody who walks past, whether that be a child to an adult, senior citizen, any kind of characteristic you could break it down. It doesn't matter. You just randomly walk up to people and say, please fill out my questionnaire. Okay. Now, what that does is that removes bias because everybody had a chance. However, it might not be valid because you might be asking people questions about a business that they've got no interaction with. So do we really want to be walking up to, say, ladies in a shopping centre to ask them their opinion about a male barber's? Now, they might have an opinion about haircuts, but have they ever experienced what it's like to go into the male barbers and da-da-da-da? No, probably not. So therein lies the problem with random sampling. You have a much bigger population to choose from, and you can certainly say you removed most of the bias, but how valid is that data? That's the big question. Up next, we have stratified, and that's a little bit more difficult to explain. Stratified breaks down an entire population into various characteristics: age, gender, income, spending habits. Okay, so think about market segmentation. And then they ask an equal amount of people from each subsector. So if we go with age and we go, right, we're going to do 0 to 10-year-olds, 11 to 20-year-olds, 21, and so on and so forth. So we're going to ask 10 0 to 10-year-olds, 10, 11 to 21-year-olds, so on and so on and so forth. Now, that will then removes even more bias because you have exactly the same amount of information from the same stratified sample. However, it's very difficult to carry out because you have to find people who are willing and able. Now, within that stratified sample, what you could do is eliminate certain people from it. So you could say, right, well, 0 to 10-year-olds are not our market, so we're not going to ask them. But we are going to ask, say, 11 to 21-year-olds, so on and so forth. So that's stratified. You break the population down into subsectors and ask the same amount of people from each subsector. Quota, on the other hand, is a little bit easier to set up, but it's in the same vein as stratified. So what you do is you go, okay, I don't necessarily need to do all of this kind of regimental bing bang bong. What I would do is I will just simply go, right, I need to break my population down into males and females because they're both appropriate to my business, and young and old. So I'm going to ask the first 50 men who walk into this shopping centre to do my questionnaire, okay, regardless of their spending habits, so on and so forth. And then I'm going to ask the first 10 senior citizens that I see. Okay, it's bold, but you could do it, right? And then I'm going to ask the first 50 women, so on and so forth. So you simply have a quota for each characteristic, and it's not necessarily broken down any further than that. Generally, it's used with like gender or age. So you'd be like, okay, I'm going to ask the first 10 teenagers that I see, or the 10 kind of old APs that I see. You do it in that way. Now, again, we have to look at the consideration of validity and bias. In quota, you remove a lot of the bias because you're just asking random people, but you again kind of lose the validity, because if you're asking the first 50 men who walk past you, again, what if your product is for, say, older people and you're asking teenagers? So, okay, yeah, technically there was a bit more randomness to it because it was a quota rather than a strict stratified sample. But how valid is that data if we're asking teenagers about clothes at M&S, for example? So that's our sampling method. So we've conducted our market research and we've done some sort of qualitative and quantitative approach. With our qualitative information, we're going to be looking for trends based on people's opinions, which is harder to do, but you can apply a little bit of psychology to it perhaps. When it comes to the quantitative data, what we're actually going to do is we're going to start maybe plotting it onto graphs, maybe pie charts, line charts, bar graphs, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to start looking for correlations. So we're going to try and look for correlations between what we ask people and what we think they mean. So let's say, for example, that we asked a very specific group of people, so that was specific to our business. So let's go with my barber example. So I've got a barber's and I asked men between the ages of, say, 15 and 50 a series of questions. So I can confirm the validity of my research because I asked the appropriate people. I used a somewhat quota-based sampling or stratified sample, depending on how you look at it. And I then gathered some information. And the questions I asked were related to price and length of haircut. And it may well be that I find that there is a correlation between how much people pay for a haircut and how long they think they should be in the chair, or the length of time the barber should take. Now, that would be considered a positive relationship, because we would assume that the more we pay, the more time that we would expect to sit in the chair. And you would draw that as a line graph with maybe price at the bottom and time up the side. And that diagram would look very similar to this in terms it would go up like this. That would be considered a positive relationship, okay, a positive correlation. Now, you would then say that it's quite a strong correlation because it's probably strongly correlated. If I paid £5 for a haircut and if I was in the chair for, say, 15 minutes, I'd think that was okay. If I paid £50 for a haircut, I'd want to be sat in that chair for an hour. And if I wasn't, I'd be upset. So there is a strong positive correlation between length of haircut and money paid. Now, it may well be that, and then I ask questions about the drinks that I serve. You know, how bothered are you that we serve tea, coffee, and fizzy drinks? And the answers to that might be somewhat negative. So, if the cost of the haircut goes up, would you expect better quality tea? And the answer is no, essentially. So that might be a negative correlation. In fact, the more I pay, the less I'm interested in the tea, the more I'm interested in my haircut. And then it might not even be a very strong correlation at all. It might be somewhat negative. So the relationship between price and drinks are negative. People aren't all that worried. In fact, the more you pay, the less they're worried about it. And it might even be really sporadic on my line graph. It might be more of a scatter graph, and there might not be a strong relationship between it. So we have weak correlations and positive or negative correlations. So things are either positively correlated, i.e. they are drawn together, or they're not. Okay. Now, that's all well and good. Generally speaking, that will just be asked as a kind of written question or multiple choice. However, we then have to consider the concept of confidence intervals. This is a tricky concept to understand. So on the board here, I've got a diagram which represents time and money earned. So between the year 0 and 2025, my business has earned this much money, that solid blue line. And you can see the dotted line here where it finishes. And we're going to say that's roughly 550K. So in 2025, my business has had a strong positive correlation between time and money made, i.e. my money's gone up. And I've made 550K. Now, what I've done is I've extrapolated, i.e. I've gone back in time, look at the trends of the last 2025 years, apparently. And I have now decided to extrapolate that data and guess, essentially, what's going to happen in the future. And I'm predicting all the way up to 2030. Now, the dashed line in the middle is my actual prediction. So I'm predicting by 2030, my business will be making £800,000 in revenue. But I'm also certain for 95% confidence intervals that it's going to sit somewhere between £1,000,000 and 500K. And what that means is that I used my previous data and I extrapolated all possible outcomes. So what is the very best case scenario that could happen? And what is the very worst case scenario? And then my prediction will land in the middle, 800K. However, I am 95% confident, based on the data I've collected, that it will be no lower than 500K, but could be as high as 1 million. Sorry, I've got a 90%, not 95. So I've got a 90% confidence in my data, i.e. I think my data is plus or minus 10%. So my data is only out by 10%. So I'm 90% certain that I could make as much as 1 million, but it could be as low as 500,000. But I am 90% certain it won't be any lower than 500,000. That's a confidence interval. Now, if I had a 95 confidence interval and a 98 and so on and so forth, what you'd probably find is that those numbers would come a little bit closer together. So confidence intervals is looking at the strength of the data you've collected and coming up with a boundary of best case and worst case scenario in the future, and knowing that your business will land somewhere in the middle. And that's usually done when we're predicting sales data. So a 90% confidence interval says that I am 90% certain that I'm either going to earn as much as 1 million or as little as 500K, but I'm 90% certain it will be within those boundaries by 2030 based on my data. That's confidence intervals. That'll do us for today's video. Join me for the next one. Any questions, put me in down below and I'll answer the comments as much as I can. See you in the next video.